Welcome to Gaslit Nation. I am your host, Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine, the film the Kremlin doesn't want you to see, so be sure to watch it. Today, we're joined by Osita Wanevu, a contributing editor at The New Republic and a columnist for The Guardian. We're talking about his new book, The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding. Yes, please. Let's go. So I want to ask, what made you want to write this book? The book that I've always wanted to write, by the way. So thank you for writing it. I'm just glad that it exists.
Well, thank you for having me. What made me want to write this book? I mean, I think that we've all had a rough 10 years or so. So we're recording now, I think, a day after the 10-year anniversary of Donald Trump coming down that escalator, right? And so, I think that the last decade or so has been an education for all of us in democratic principles, what makes democracy important. All of these things have kind of been in the air. For me, they've been in the air since I was a kid. One of the first political stories I remember ever following was the 2000 election. I remember being really incensed that George Bush won for reasons I don't think I fully understood, but kind of like got trickled down to me from...
There was a Brooks Brother riot. The Supreme Court just came in and just sealed the deal for the Republicans, and the Democrats didn't put up the fight they needed to put up. Yes, it was very traumatic, especially for us young people who were just learning, being told, oh, you can vote now, or, you get ready to vote, the power of your vote. And you're like, wait, do I have the power of the vote? Go ahead.
Right. So, I mean, I was in second grade, so I feel like there's a lot of that I didn't understand, but I did get this sort of basic sense of unfairness from the whole thing. More people voted for this person. Why is this other person the president? By 2016, I'd learned a lot more. And to see it happen again, I think was really kind of radicalizing for me. And I think for a lot of people. And so that basic flaw there of our system, the Electoral College twice so far this century has brought somebody to the White House who lost a popular vote. That's a problem. In both cases, it had catastrophic consequences for the country. That was in my head. But also, as I covered the 2020 Democratic primary and I covered the beginning of the Biden administration, I found myself having to say over and over again, well, yes, most Americans want this to happen on immigration reform or gun control or on the minimum wage, but it's probably not going to happen because of the Senate. And even if it does pass Congress, it's going to run into this buzzsaw at the Supreme Court, maybe in many cases. And having to say that over and over again frustrated me. And it frustrated me again as somebody who, as all of us are sort of brought up to believe that this is a democracy. This is a country in which what the people want is supposed to prevail. We sort of lord ourselves over other countries on this basis. And we told these great stories about what a great democracy this is. But it seemed, more and more I was having to write about things and explain things that really undermine that self-perception. And that was sort of the first impetus for me to sort of dig into what democracy meant in the first place. And the other thing, too, was, when you raise some of these issues to people, especially people on the right, they'll tell you, well, that's fine because America actually isn't a democracy, we're a republic. And there are reasons why we should distrust, actually, democratic authority being given to the masses. And this is something you'd hear on the right all the time, but I think actually more and more so, especially actually since November, you do have people asking themselves this question, if people are broadly misinformed or they're biased by misinformation or we're polarized as we seem to be, should we even trust and have faith in democracy in the first place? Isn't there something to the idea that there should be limits on democratic power? You see this more and more, or hear this more and more, I think, from people in the center or even liberals. And so that was another thing that I wanted to confront too. And, overall, I think this is an important conversation to have because, for those of us who are committed to democracy, it's not good to have the general public doubting its possibilities and doubting that it can work, which is, I think, one of the reasons why so many people did take an interest in Donald Trump. They saw a political system that wasn't working in their interests. They weren't sure what democracy was doing for them. It was this thing that people told them was important in civics, back whenever, if they were lucky enough to have civics. But they didn't really understand or sort of take it for granted, as many of us did, that democracy is worth preserving and keeping. And I think that we have to have an affirmative case for it if we really want to defend it from authoritarians.
So in your book, The Right of the People, you basically present a bit of a grand plan What would you say? Because my listeners, they come to me very frustrated. Like, what should we all be doing? What is the best use of our time? We go to protests, we vote, we try to get out the vote. But what are we really doing? It feels just like we're going through the motions in a time of hyper normalization and that everything's crumbling around us and we're just spitting at a house fire while trapped in the house. So what do you see as sort of like, if you could assemble all the democracy fighters, all the coalitions that are on the front lines and bring them all together, give them bottles of wine so suddenly everyone's getting along and everyone's, talking to each other, what would you advise them to do? Like, this is what we should all be working towards, like this sort of roadmap. What would you like to see in terms of reforms and rebuilding?
Well, that is a massive, massive question.
Because these are the conversations we're having.
These are the conversations that we're having, of course. I think the most difficult thing for people to accept, I feel, is the scale of the change that's required. I think that we're thinking too small, and I think that thinking bigger can feel daunting, but if you're not thinking at the level or at the scale of the challenge, you're going to wind up perpetually frustrated because you're not actually getting anywhere. It has been really, really heartening in the last week especially to see so many people come out for the No Kings protests or other demonstrations and talk about the ways in which Donald Trump is flouting the rule of law, violating the Constitution, doing things that an executive is not supposed to do. I think all of that is true. All of that is great. At the same time, I think that we're not going to get very far in improving our political situation and preventing the rise of another Donald Trump if we don't also confront the ways in which the Constitution has brought us to this point. And I know it's extremely hard. I was out there in DC on Saturday at one of these protests. It wasn't a No Kings protest, but it was another protest. And you have people coming up passionately saying, what, I took an oath to defend the Constitution. I swore I would defend the Constitution. It hurts me to see Donald Trump doing these things. All of that is very true. We need the rule of law. We need a set of procedures to govern it. But the reality is Donald Trump is where he is because in 2016, the Constitution elevated him to the White House over the wishes of most of the people who went to the polls that year. When he was in office, it was difficult to remove him because the Constitution, even though most Americans thought that he had done wrong, imposed a very, very high threshold for moving him from office. The fact that the Republican Party has an amount of power in the Senate that makes it easier for them to frustrate both legislation and things like impeachment proceedings also helped him. And I think that this all created a kind of sense of invulnerability amongst a lot of voters. Well, the institutions didn't really prevent Trump, didn't stop him, seemed, if anything, to abet him. So why should we really care about the integrity of these institutions? Donald Trump obviously can beat them all, and we should just sort of vote on the basis of our feelings about the economy in this particular moment. I think that's partially what happened in 2024. So Donald Trump, we are dealing with as a political figure and not this kind of also-ran who had it not been for the Electoral College, would have lost. He's here because of the Constitution in many important respects. Our inability to solve some of our basic problems, whether that is the immigration issue he's taken advantage of, or other economic problems that are frustrating people, that's also a consequence of how difficult it is to pass policy now at the federal level because of the Senate and because of the Fed filibuster. So there are political challenges that we're facing, kind of perversely because of these institutions. And I feel like there's a reluctance amongst liberals and amongst people who are rightfully incensed and angry about Donald Trump to sort of take that on and to say to ourselves, we need not just a kind of movement to get rid of Donald Trump, although we obviously need to do that. We need to confront the ways in which our institutions have radically empowered a right that doesn't believe in democracy. And that's going to continue to challenge us whenever Donald Trump leaves the field. So that's not a concrete, this is what you as a voter needs to do, tomorrow to fix the situation. But I do think that understanding the problem correctly is going to help us and set us on the right path. We need to be asking our leaders not just to talk about Donald Trump, but hey, let's talk about the way that the Supreme Court has been really crazy over the last 10 years and the amount of power that the Supreme Court has in general to overturn things that people want. Let's talk about the fact that a voter in Wyoming has 60-something times the representation in the Senate that somebody in California does, and how that leads to situations like Donald Trump sending troops into Los Angeles to overturn things because he doesn't like their immigration policy. There are basic structural questions that I feel like people aren't really confronting yet, and that we should, because if we don't, again, I think that we're going to find ourselves, even absent Donald Trump, staring down the barrel of a really, really undemocratic and increasingly deranged and difficult political situation.
We do have the 14th Amendment, which could have barred Trump and other members of Congress who were inciting violence on January 6th. January 6th, believe your eyes, believe your ears. We watched on live television as the MAGA movement incited a violent attempted overthrow of our democracy. And we had a mechanism. We did have a mechanism. We had the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Colorado, a group in Colorado tried to get that enforced, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, we don't think a state can oversee a federal election. Okay, well then where's Congress? Like, this was an act of Congress and the courts, but Congress, when it was under Democratic control following Biden's victory in 2020, the Democrats didn't touch the 14th Amendment either. Right. And they held 2 years of hearings, which were extremely compelling. They showed a lot of chilling montage footage of that violence, but they didn't, it was sort of like a distraction. They punted on the 14th Amendment, and they gave themselves credit forcing Merrick Garland, Attorney General, to take up this case. Why would Merrick Garland need to be pushed in the first place when he was sworn in right after one of the most violent attacks against our democracy? So the whole thing just seems like yes, our system isn't imperfect because given who built it, slave owners and men. And so it was imperfect from the start. But also there's a dereliction of duty to even exercise the levers of power that we do have in the Constitution. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's true. Look, I think that people in Congress and obviously in the judiciary have fallen down on the job of protecting us from this madman. I don't think that there's any argument to be had about that. I do think, though, that one of the reasons why they have, or the Republicans especially have in Congress isn't doing their job because Republicans have the amount of power that they have in Congress. It's because they know that they can get away with it. Republicans in Congress are not beholden to a broadly representative segment of the public. It's a institution, a chamber that was designed to grant equal representation to each particular state, right? And we know, political scientists have studied this, legal scholars have studied this. We know that this has benefited the Republican Party for a long, long time. It's a more durable bias than the Electoral College even. And so I think that there are a lot of Republicans who've been looking at Donald Trump in general, even before January 6th, and said to themselves, well, look, maybe I don't like what's going on in principle, but I'm beholden to Republican primary voters in Nebraska and nobody else. And so my particular responsibility here, in my perspective, is outweighed by the basic electoral situation that I face as a representative, right? You would expect them or hope that they would, have the courage to do the right thing. But these are politicians. I don't have a very high evaluation of politicians and their incentives in general. You won't come away from the book, I think, feeling more confident about politicians. But look, the Republican Party doesn't have to do the right thing. That's the long and short of it. It's in this political situation where, as much as it backs Donald Trump to the hilt, as much as it backs his unpopular policies to the hilt, we have this big, beautiful bill, quote unquote, that's advancing through Congress now with terrible, terrible policies that most Americans don't like. Republicans are insulated from the blowback from a lot of those things because of the Senate, because of gerrymandering the House. And so the lack of responsibility that they're taking, I think, is shaped by and influenced too by the structural conditions that they face within our system, right? If they don't have incentives to do the right thing, and if they're not facing penalties for not doing the right thing, they're not going to do the right thing. They're not going to resist Donald Trump. And again, I think that this is a challenge that's going to continue to undermine governance even after Donald Trump leaves and we're left with the Republican Party that he has radicalized these polls to the right. One of the things I think is worth mentioning too, actually, is political scientists are also now telling us that one of the reasons why the Republican Party has moved to the right so often is what I was saying to begin with. They're not facing representative groups of voters. And that means that the things that they say about immigration, things that they say about crime, things that they say about climate change being fake, the misinformation they put out, if your only real election is the primary and you're only really talking to voters who watch Fox News, that is going to pull your senator, your representative further and further and further to the right. More so than if we had a genuinely democratic system where people had to care about voters from different parts of the country, not just rural voters, not just conservative voters, but if Republicans had to win the votes, to win a presidential election or to control the Senate or, to control Congress, if they had to take the votes of people in New York City or Chicago or places like Baltimore where I live more seriously, you wouldn't have this temptation of this slide to the right that we've seen over the last, not just 10 years, but I think since Obama's term in 2009, 2010. So, I think it's true that we're not seeing our representatives, our leaders, doing the right thing, especially on the Republican side. But I think that we should also take seriously the fact that they have a lot of reasons on the basis of their own self-interest not to do the right thing. And we should be trying to change those structural incentives and hope that they might pull the Republican Party closer to where most voters are.
So if we roll up our sleeves and we establish a new American revolution, a new American founding, would you recommend that we put our energy towards the National Vote Compact, which is just a few states away from getting enough states in the union to sign on to basically give their electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote? And that would ensure that the National Vote Compact will ensure that the popular vote winner gets the election, the presidential election, and this would circumvent the Electoral College. And it's a very legal route to do it, and it's got bipartisan support. Is that an effort that you would endorse people get involved in?
So, National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, I'm not sure how much your listeners know about it, but just as the briefest possible summary, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is an attempt to institute the popular vote in presidential elections by getting a number of states that totals the 270 you need to win to say, okay, we're just going to throw our electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote. If that happens, you've functionally invalidated the Electoral College as we know it today. You've moved to a popular vote system. We're very close to actually having the number of state legislatures we need to do this. The last remaining states are actually, pretty mixed politically. They're like purplish states. The liberal states, I think, have already mostly gone ahead and done this. I would 100% endorse this effort. It's a mystery to me why Democrats haven't pushed it harder. I think there are legal questions. I think it's inevitable that this would face some kind of challenge at the Supreme Court eventually. But look, this is the only game in town as far as changing the Electoral College system that I've really seen anybody come up with. The process of constitutional amendment now is impossible. You're never going to get the requisite number of states to voluntarily give up their Electoral College votes or influence in the system with the threshold that you need to pass a constitutional amendment. It's just too high. So that leaves the NPVIC, and I think it's a no-brainer reform that I think more money should be invested in. As best as I can tell, when I wrote about this a few years ago, it's this pretty small group of people who are trying to push this through without any institutional support.
But it always is, though. That's the story of progress. It's always a small group of people that are like a dog with a bone. And they win. And that's how we have these rights today. But go on.
That's right. And I think, honestly, that is kind of the model we need to be looking towards. As difficult as it may seem, we need to be finding reforms that actually deliver us the large-scale changes that we need and just kind of push for them in any way we can, think creatively about what they might be. This was a very, very creative workaround and solution to the Electoral College that I'm glad somebody came up with. And, as off the wall as it might have seemed at the time, we're now close to a point where it actually might make a difference if people keep churning away and working at it. One other thing that I recommend in the book and might sort of help us think through what people can do immediately is think about political reforms at the state level. State constitutions are actually much easier to amend than the federal constitution is. You already see states and localities too, experimenting things with ranked choice voting and other forms of voting, creating different kinds of bodies. These are things that I think people can do even in their own communities and in their own states that might provide a kind of proof of concept for expanding democracy at the federal level. And people practice that they need to push for these reforms at the federal level too. So, check out, I would say, provisions of your state constitution or your city charter, this structure of government wherever you happen to live, and see if there are things you can do to begin democratizing your own community and getting people more involved, getting people more engaged. That, I think, builds up to hopefully a pro-democracy movement nationwide that can actually push for federal change. Once we've demonstrated to people again, because I think we're at a point where this needs to be demonstrated and proven, it will help people see that democracy can work. If you can democratize a community, deliver gains, that builds the case for larger scale change throughout the entire country.
Absolutely. So the drugged up psychopath, Elon Musk, who happens to be the richest man on the planet because we're in hell, he was, went on stage famously with a chainsaw and he's slashing all this government waste and fraud that he claims he's finding. And Republicans, MAGA world is cheering him on until it's their job that gets chopped by Elon Musk. But, you saw this sort of right-wing movement of cut taxes, cut government waste. Well, it seems then we can make it a bipartisan issue to abolish the Senate. That's a ton of savings right there, paying for all those senators and their staffs and their lunches and their office space. So I feel like, just like the National Vote Compact seemed like a far-fetched idea, now it's gaining traction and we're close. Abolish the Senate could be the next big bipartisan moonshot that we could start normalizing. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would hope it would be bipartisan. I don't know that it would be. But look, I mean, there was a piece in The Atlantic written by John Dingell, the congressman before he died, longest-serving congressman, that made this case. This was not some wild-haired radical from the outside. This is somebody who knows Congress, worked in Congress for a long time, saying the Senate, as we know it today, is not tenable. We have to get rid of it eventually. I think it would save money. That's not an angle that I thought of, but I think it would certainly be appealing to a lot of voters on that basis. But look, I mean, I think the key thing to say about the Senate is that it has been such a, hurdle in terms of getting things that most Americans want through. And that's very basic things, like, again, raising the minimum wage, high levels of support for that, raising taxes on the rich, high levels of support for that. The Senate is where ideas like this go to die. And, I don't know that the American people should be expected to accept that for much longer. This was an institution that we should say too, as much as people like the founders, think that the founders were smart, I think they certainly were deeply, deeply intelligent men who had a lot of important things to say. This was a body that people said from the outset, this is the chamber that's going to represent the rich people of this country. It's going to represent property. It's going to be the kind of check on ordinary people implementing the policies that they want, especially economic policy. One of the stories that I tell in this book is about how the economic depression that we faced after the Revolutionary War, the largest economic crisis we would face until the Great Depression, actually, it led people to pursue basically, relief policies at the state level that a lot of the wealthiest people in the country didn't like. They thought it was going to undermine, destabilize their own wealth, and they opposed it on that basis. And the construction of a federal government that was less accessible, they thought, to democratic authority, that would sort of clamp down on democratic movements at the state level. That was one of the reasons why they wrote the Constitution in the first place. And the Senate was kind of the cornerstone of that entire project. And to this day, it remains a body of many millionaires who are, telling us that we can't do this or that. And I don't think that, the American people should be expected to stand for that for much longer. I think that, as pie in the sky as it might seem, look, we are, one of very, very few countries with an upper house as unequal as the Senate is. I think only Argentina and Brazil mathematically have upper houses that are as distorted as ours is in terms of, how equally people are represented no matter where they live in the country. The Wyoming, California example, I tout out because it makes things very, very clear. This is not a body that has worked in your interest ever. If you live in a big city, if you live in a place like Baltimore, where you have so many challenges that we hope the federal government will take an interest in eventually. One of the reasons why they won't is because we have a Senate that privileges the interests of rural and pretty conservative people. Those people absolutely matter. We absolutely have to have politicians and policymakers take the interests of people who live in small towns, rural communities seriously. But those people don't matter more than any other American. They shouldn't have their votes count dozens of times more than those of us who happen to live in urban areas. And yeah, I think that this is something that hopefully 100 years from now, 150 years from now, people will see as obvious. Why did they persist for so long with a system that was so obviously unequal and unjust? So, yeah, I don't know. I think that we are in a place where we can start asking ourselves these questions and thinking more ambitiously about reforming the very structures of our government.
And it will energize people too.
Yes.
We need the power of imagination now. And so I want to also ask, we have neutralized the threat of Electoral College with the National Vote Compact. We've abolished the Senate through a bipartisan cost savings grassroots movement. And that leaves us now the House, which is so tilted towards the Republicans, thanks to gerrymandering. What have you seen that is promising in terms of undoing the damage of gerrymandering?
Yeah, so there are a number of states that have moved to independent redistricting. So having this kind of bipartisan body draw the maps instead of having it this kind of partisan game people play every census. That's it's a good idea. I don't know that we've seen the impacts that people had hoped for with that, but certainly I think that we should be moving towards having districts drawn in a nonpartisan fashion. I think the things that will pay off more is, again, thinking deeply about the very structure of the thing itself. So one of the dynamics beyond gerrymandering that shapes control of the House is the fact that you have these agglomerations of people, in particular urban districts, that, end up meaning that more districts spatially are controlled by rural representatives, right? You have what they call this phenomenon of wasted votes. If people had been more spread out, they would have had more influence across a greater number of districts. They would have had kind of equalization of representation that you don't have when all the districts are sort of or all the people are concentrated into urban areas on the Democratic side. That dynamic, even above and on top of gerrymandering, is something that I think advantages the right that we should look at. But the reform that I think is most promising would be moving actually to a system of proportional representation. So Lee Drutman writes about this. A lot of other political scientists have written about this. Instead of having one representative per district, maybe you have a system in which people go and there are multiple representatives per district. They have what they're called multi-member districts. And so, maybe the majority of people or plurality of people vote for the Democratic Party and they win like 40% of the seats. And then you also have Republican representatives in that same district who win, 30% of the available seats there. And so each district has this kind of melange of different people from both parties. And that actually, people have said, might lead to the flourishing or the development of other parties, because now you have a chance of winning some representation in Congress, even if you're not winning the 40% or the 50% that you have to win now in order to get even one representative. Now, even small parties might send people to Congress. This, I think, would be a healthier way of doing politics than we're used to now. And I think it would help heal some of our political divides too, honestly. If you look at a rural district in this country and you see not just this one Republican representative who's only representing the conservatives there, but you see some Republicans and some Democrats, that changes your picture of like who even lives in these districts, right? You have different perspectives on how to solve that district's problems, instead of a system in which we look out at the map and we say, oh, this is a red area or this is a blue area, right? You see that the country is actually much more divided and diverse. You get more voices in the mix. So I think proportional representation would be a good thing to move towards for all kinds of reasons on the House side. And again, this is another big pie in the sky kind of reform, but one that I think we should be inching our way towards. We're not going to get there if we don't even tell ourselves that that's somewhere we should be looking to go.
But how unsexy does proportional representation sound? Like how do I sell that? Like I'm phone banking. I've got this mom on the phone who's cooking, doesn't want to hear from me. I'm like, listen, have you heard about proportion? So how do you, I don't want to, what is the sexy way? Give me, I know you're a journalist, you're not a spin doctor, but what is the heart of the matter on proportional representation? What is the burnt out mom? How do you get through to somebody who's sleep deprived and try to explain this to them that this is in their own best interest?
I'd say that we need to fix Washington, and that means that we need to break away from the system that is preventing Democrats and Republicans from actually coming together to solve this country's problems. If we had proportional representation, you'd have a more diverse set of voices.
But what is it?
What is proportional representation? I mean, it is a system in which everybody's voice matters. That's the way I put it. If you come to an election and you vote, and the person who wins, 40% of the vote in your district is a Republican, and you voted for the Democrat, you don't get anything, right? You don't send anybody to Congress. If you have proportional representation, you would. You would send fewer people to Congress than the Republicans do, but you would still have your voice heard. So proportional representation is a system in which every vote truly matters and every vote truly counts.
So it would require
that's the simplest. Yeah,
you'd have to redo the maps. You'd have to redo the map then.
You'd have to change a lot of things. Definitely not going to get into it here and now, but I think the simplest way to say it is that if you've ever been frustrated by paying attention during an election, engaging with the community, getting out there, maybe even voting early, doing all the things you're supposed to, only to see some other party win and you not getting anything for your effort, proportional representation fixes that, because you will send somebody who represents you to Congress. That's, I think, the easiest, simplest kind of elevator pitch for it. Don't have to be a political scientist. I think that's I don't know. It sounds good to me.
Sounds good to me. And so that I want to also ask a final question on us together, launching a revolution through this show and through your book. And so we fixed all of these issues, but then we still have oligarchs owning increasingly our mainstream media. We have hedge funds destroying journalism, as you know too well. You've watched this as much as I have play out over the years. And then we have Sinclair turn local news into Fox News. It's pretty Russian, what's happening to our information space across this nation. And there's a lot of local news deserts as well. So, and then social media, of course, big tech, and they're just selling us all out with their algorithms that are, white men dominate the big tech world, are the majority of the engineers out there, and their algorithms show that with the manosphere getting all these boosts and brain rotting, especially young Gen Z men. So what is the solution to that then? And that's private. I mean, obviously you could have government regulations step in, but then that's a slippery slope of free speech and it could work against us too.
Okay. So I think this is like one of the biggest questions of the book. And I think one of the places where the book is probably the most provocative. So I would actually flip this. I don't think that you actually get to the political reforms that we've just been talking about without addressing the economic inequality that sends somebody like Elon Musk into government in the first place, right? Or that leads to the domination of these media companies. There has been a lot of important work people have done to draw attention to things like Citizens United, to draw attention to the ways that lobbying influences policymaking, to draw attention to campaign finance reform. And these are definitely all ways that the wealthy end up shaping political outcomes, determining who even gets to contest or compete in an election in the first place. And we should also, obviously fix all of those things. I think one of the reasons why it's been so difficult for us to actually do that is because the wealthy people have so much power and influence on the basis of their wealth in the first place. Like they can send people to Washington who will prevent us from passing those laws in the first place, or they can influence elections in a way that prevent us from enacting those political reforms in the first place, right? So the wealth inequality that we're facing in society, I think, actually has to be confronted as its own problem and issue, right? It's not something that we can just expect to send people to Washington to fix because they will then be influenced by wealth inequality in the first place. You have to sort of understand the economic situation, from my perspective, as underlying some of the political problems that we're facing to begin with. How does Elon Musk even acquire the $400 billion that he has so that, spending $250 million on an election or however much he spent to elect Donald Trump, is available for him to influence the political process? Like, how does somebody garner that much wealth and power in the first place? If we don't resolve that, I think that our efforts to foster and build up and protect political democracy are going to falter. And so a large portion of this book is about confronting economic inequality, and I make the case for certain policies that I think also bring democracy into the economy. Back in the ancient world, I think people took it for granted and understood that you could not have political democracy sustain itself in a society in which people have, vastly more money, much more wealth than an ordinary person. Obviously, the influence of ordinary people was going to be undermined by that inequity. We've sort of lost sight of that. We've convinced ourselves that you can actually sustain a democracy when somebody is on their way to having $1 trillion at their disposal. I don't think that that's true. I think Elon Musk has done us a service in showing us that that is going to be a challenge. And so there are ultimately ways that we wrest power and wealth from these people before they enter politics in order to protect democracy and also to sort of improve our own economic situation. So I talk about unions a lot in this book. I talk a lot about different reforms we can take or sort of borrow from Europe that allow working people, ordinary people, more of a say in corporations, that would have them influence where money is going, how much money CEOs and investors are allowed to accrue, that would allow them to shape corporate decision making in such a way that corporations would have less authority to, influence our elections or to fund super PACs and so on. If workers were at the table making these decisions themselves, not just CEOs that wanted to get wealthy on the basis of policymaking in Washington. So the long story short is that I think the key challenge there is figuring out how to empower ordinary people, not just in Washington, but within the economy, where people are moving from their wealth, from their power to Washington or to our political system in ways that undermine our capacity to actually fulfill even political democracy.
Thank you so very much, Osita Uenevu, the author of the must-read, just out book, The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding. All right, I have a few extra questions for you that we do for fun, very rapid fire. It's called the Gaslit Nation Self-Care Q&A. There's no wrong answers. It's like the Proust questionnaire, updated for these times. What's a book everyone should read and why, other than yours?
Other than mine? Let's see. A book everyone should read for sure is called Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann. It's a book that was written in 1922, and it's about democracy to a large extent. It's about all of the ways in which people have a hard time getting the information that they need to make good informed political decisions, all the challenges that make that difficult. Now, Walter Lippmann ends up proposing certain solutions that I don't think are right. I think he ends very kind of pessimistic about democracy and argue in the book, why I think he was wrong to go down the road that he did. But it still remains, I think, one of the clearest depictions of the challenges of maintaining an informed electorate that I think I've ever seen. I mean, this is a man writing in 1922 about the ways that technology would make it more difficult for us to get accurate information. He was talking about radio back then, right? All of those challenges have obviously multiplied tenfold, but the same dynamics are in play. Some of the same things he was talking about in 1922 are the same things we're dealing with in social media today. I think it's really, really fascinating, and people will definitely get a lot out of reading that, and it'll help them understand what we're going through.
What's a documentary everyone should watch?
Oh boy, documentary everyone should watch. I'm really fond of the documentary. Well, I'm fond of the subject of the documentary itself. It's kind of cheating, but there's a documentary called Best of Enemies by, I think, Morgan Neville, and I forget who else did it, from 2015, I want to say. And it's about the debates between Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley during the 1968 Democratic National Convention. It's really entertaining. You begin to see some of the currents of contemporary politics play through their arguments over the course of those debates. But those debates are also some of the first instances of basically political television as entertainment. The kind of talking head media ecosystem that we take for granted today. This is one of the sort of beginning points of all of that developing. And I think people will find that really interesting to see.
What's a dramatic film or comedy everyone should watch?
Oh my goodness. Dramatic film or comedy. On the same theme, I think everybody should watch Network from the mid-70s. Again, it's about the media. It's about some of the the beginnings of the world that we now live in. News as entertainment. I think it's a tremendous, tremendous satire. And yeah, I think people find a lot about our contemporary situation presaged by the things that are said and that happen in that movie.
Who are some of your historical mentors who inspire you?
Historical mentors that inspire me. I mean, I like a lot of the mid-century writers. I like Joan Didion a lot. I mean, I don't know that I would know anything about writing if I hadn't sort of taken to reading her closely and understanding how her sentences worked.
Which book specifically of hers?
I like the essays in Slouching Towards Bethlehem a lot. I mean, I think that those were especially formative to me. Some of her coverage of the elections in the 80s, I think what she wrote about Jesse Jackson, that's when I go back to. There's one essay that I read about her growing up in Sacramento that I recently reread that has a sentence in there that I've always taken with me, because I think it is an encapsulation of so much that's emanated out of California, even in the last 20 years. It's where she says that, California is shaped by faith or a desire to believe that anything is possible there, because that is where we run out of continent. So all of the energy of the westward expansion and all of the optimism of it just sort of crashing up against the against the edge of America. And, there's a sense in which I think that explains Silicon Valley. I think that explains Hollywood from a certain perspective. So anyway, I like her because I think that in sentences like that, she encompasses so many different ideas at once in just a line or half a line. And, I've been tremendously inspired by her writing.
What's the best concert you've ever been to?
The best concert I've ever been to was My Bloody Valentine's tour stop in Chicago. I want to say in whenever that last album they did was, 2013, I want to say. Yeah. So My Bloody Valentine is a shoegaze band from the early 90s. He put out this one classic album in 1991 and didn't put out anything else until 2013. And people have been waiting for it, wondering if it was ever going to happen. The first album had been like years and years and years in the making itself and was involved in this deep, deep production process. But they finally came up with a second one when I was in college. It was this first concert I think I'd ever been to. And it was also the loudest concert I'd ever been to. And I expect that to remain the case for the rest of my life. They're a very, very loud band. They pass out earplugs during the shows. You could see pieces of the ceiling falling during the concert. It was so loud, but it was beautiful. I mean, it's music that is crushingly loud, but also really, really beautifully layered and pretty, honestly. So I really will treasure that concert for the rest of my life.
What are some songs on your playlist for battling the dark forces?
Oh my goodness. One song that I added to my playlist recently is a song called Underdog by Sly and the Family Stone. We just lost Sly Stone, I think, in the last week or so. And yeah, I mean, that was a group that embodied, I think, a lot of progressive ideals back at a time when music was just beginning to get a little bit political, but still it was unusual to hear bands talk about racial equality as explicitly as they did, to have a racially integrated band. But they have this song called Underdog that is about keeping the fight alive and keeping the hope alive as you push for progress. And I think that's one people should listen to for sure.
Who or what inspires you to stay engaged and stay in the fight?
Stay engaged and stay in the fight. I mean, I've been inspired by, again, just sort of seeing the number of people who came out this past weekend from No Kings protests, especially. I know that Indivisible was a big part of that. Ezra Levin, Lake Greenberg, they've been doing, just unbelievably good work since Trump came in the first term, and it's been really inspiring to see what they put together. But also, the number of people from all walks of life coming together to say no to what's going on right now. It made me feel that, there is a hope and a real chance of us moving forward in a dramatically different direction. As dark as things seem now, I think that we ought to be inspired by our own energy in this moment too.
Beautifully said. What's the best advice you've ever gotten?
Best advice I've ever gotten. Damn, that's pretty hard. I mean, I don't know if it's a particular line of advice or anything, but my parents always told me, it's going to sound corny, that I could do or be anything that I really set my mind to. Now, this is not true. There was no chance of me ever becoming like a ballerina or an astronaut or like a nuclear physicist. Like, there are certain things that I couldn't have done. I think even if I had worked really, really hard to do them. But being told that, or something close to it, by people who love you is extremely important. To have this sense of possibility that says to each and every one of us that there is some kind of deep innate potential for something really, really great, if we just find it. I think that's the important thing to carry with you. And frankly, it's informed my politics too. One of the reasons why I care so much about democracy is that it's a system that allows us to develop in this way. We're not just taking it for granted that the people who should tell us what to do are, aristocrats or kings or wealthy people. It's a system that takes for granted that there's something of value in each and every one of us, right? That should give us the right to shape lives at our own direction and not the direction of somebody else. And yeah, I think that my politics are informed by that deep sense of human possibility. There is something valuable and worthy in all of us, no matter who we happen to be, no matter what circumstances that we find ourselves in. We ought to create a society where we can be the people that we want to be and could be if we're given a real shot and a real chance.
What's your favorite place you've ever visited?
I really love Chicago. I didn't really visit there. I lived there for several years while I was going to college. I mean, it is a tremendous city with a lot of history, a lot of great food, and a lot of extraordinary people. A great city to learn about politics. Yeah, I don't know. There's something about Chicago that always tugs at me ever since I went to college there. It's just a city that contains so much of what America has been and can be. There's a lot of you can tell a story about this country just by sort of telling a story about Chicago, and I think that's really special. And even the kind of layout of the city culturally, is this kind of patchwork quilt. You have communities that are, historically where, Eastern European people came to settle, or cities now where, there's like a large Hispanic population, immigrant population. And to be able to sort of go to different parts of one place and have such different like cultural experiences. And I don't know, there's something really, really special about that place. And I think something that captures a lot about this country.
What's your final question? What is your favorite work of art and why?
Favorite work of art. I guess if you're defining work of art broadly, my favorite film is Lawrence of Arabia. I was on a podcast talking about it recently. I think that it is that medium operating, like firing on all cylinders on every front. The music is perfect. The cinematography is perfect. Performances are unbelievable. But also, I think that the more that you see that movie, you also appreciate how well written it is as a character study. It is difficult to pull off a movie that is so epic and sweeping and is operating on a large scale that is also an intimate study of one person. And I think it does both of those things. I also think the politics of that movie are kind of underrated too. I think it is an anti-colonial movie that tells us about the follies and depravity of imperialism and I think it's not often read that way by people, but I think that it is a movie that I think ought to resonate with people who have any kind of like anti-colonial orientation. So yeah, I really, really like that film. It's one of the films that convinced me, for a time that I would get into film myself, actually. It was one of the first adult movies that I ever watched with my dad, and it's always stuck with me ever since.
That's one of my dad's favorite movies, and I'm actually staying with my parents right now. And as you were talking, I was like, "Oh, I got
big dad movie."
It's I know. As you're talking, I was like, for Father's Day, which just happened. I got my dad a bunch of like Lush bath products, and then at the my dad's in like this tennis group with all these old Ukrainians, and I think one rubbed it in his face about all this cool things his daughter did for him, like made him brunch, all the things that I didn't do because I'm busy. So I'm like, I got to make it up to Dad. We're gonna watch Lawrence of Arabia this week again. What do you think was driving Lawrence? Like, what do you, when you as a character study, like, what do you think was his when you watch that film? And this is what you'd have to get down pat as a filmmaker, by the way.
Yeah. The joke that I now tell about that film is that it's a film about why you should never give gifted kids any power because they'll turn into war criminals.
100% true. I just want to interrupt you really quickly because we're reading The Gay Revolution by Lillian Faderman for Gaslit Nation's Book of the Month, and she talks about that. She talks about the tension between the mainstream activists and the street fighters, but the street fighters were all trust fund kids that had the luxury to be radical because they had financial safety nets. But go on.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about like it's a joke, obviously, but like there's something like he believed that he was destined for greatness. He also at least told himself that he was sympathetic to the plight of the Arabs. I think he told himself that was what he was driving him. But I think in the background, he knew that he was really smart. He knew that he was really good at languages, and his actual life of T.U. Lawrence is fascinating. He was very, very precocious, very gifted at a lot of things. But the issue there is that, that doesn't necessarily give you wisdom. It doesn't give you certainly the right to sort of dictate to people how they ought to conduct themselves. And it shouldn't allow you to sort of think of yourself as this kind of uniquely, singularly empowered or enlightened person. I think that movie also operates as the kind of, I don't know if metaphor is the right word, but that is the disposition I think the United States has had towards so much of the world, that we are this, blessed and, uniquely gifted nation that can sort of go around and go to the Middle East too and sort of rearrange things. And this is a movie that shows you the folly of believing that. But I think he was motivated by this kind of sense of this deep, deep, deep sense of self-regard, which was, maybe partially justified by how intelligent he obviously was, but, it left him blind to a lot of things. And I think, it left him blind to deeper parts of his own humanity and the humanity of the people he was leading around.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up at the Truth Teller level or higher on Patreon. Discounted annual memberships are available, and you can also give the gift of membership. All summer long, Gaslit Nation, created with love and anger, has been presenting a special series featuring leading experts on how to smash the patriarchy and the oligarchy to make the world safer for everyone. Trump didn't happen overnight. Let's plant seeds of hope together. For the hottest of hot takes, join the conversation at the Gaslit Nation salons every Monday at 4 p.m. Eastern. I'll be there with our global community of listeners. Come for deep dives into the news, learn from fellow listeners, and share what's happening in your corner of the world. Can't make it live? Recordings of our Monday salons are available on Patreon, along with our monthly Gaslit Nation book club. Access the salons, bonus shows, ad-free episodes, and more at patreon.com/gaslit. That's patreon.com/gaslit. Thank you to everyone who supports the show. To help Ukraine with urgently needed humanitarian aid, join me in donating to Razom for Ukraine at razomforukraine.org. To support refugees in conflict zones, donate to Doctors Without Borders at doctorswithoutborders.org. And to protect critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Andrea Chalupa. Our editing wizard is Nicholas Torres. And our associate producer is Carlin Daigle. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And don't forget to check out our Patreon. It keeps us going. Original music in Gaslit Nation is composed by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle. Our logo design was generously donated to us by Hamish Smythe of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish. Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher: Todd, Dan, Milo, and Cubby, Ruth Ann Harnish, Abby Zavos, Lily Wachowski, Ice Bear is Defiant, Sherry Escobar, Sydney Davies, Work for Better, Prep for Trouble, that's right, John Schoenthaler, Ellen McGirt, Larry Gasson, Amber Tino, David East, Mark, Sean Berg, Kristen Custer, Kevin Gannon, Sandra Collins, Katie Masuris, James D. Leonard, Leo Chalupa, Carol Golstad, Marcus J. Trent, Joe Darcy, D.L. Singfield, Nicole Spear, Jans Alstrup Rasmussen, Mark, Diana Gallagher, Leah Campbell, Jared Lombardo, Randall Brewer, and Tanya Chalupa. Thank you all so much for your support of the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.